They didn't execute him with a blade. They didn't drag him before a crowd. They sealed him inside a temple, stone by stone, and walked away. No trial. No sentence read aloud. No last words. Just the sound of masonry closing over the entrance, while a man stood inside, breathing air that was already running out. And the worst part? He could hear them outside, working slowly. His own mother carried a stone to the wall, set it down, and left. That man, the one suffocating in the dark, had once commanded every Greek soldier on the field at Plataea. He broke the Persian invasion. He saved the civilization that was now walling him in. His name was Pausanias, and the distance between savior of Greece and a body pulled from a sealed temple is shorter than anyone in Sparta wanted to admit. But to understand how that distance collapsed, you have to go back to a battlefield covered in Persian dead, and the single decision that changed him forever. Before we go further, this channel just crossed 100,000 subscribers because of you. Every view, every minute you stayed, built this. Thank you. We don't take that lightly. Now this is where the story changes. 479 BC. The largest land army Persia had ever assembled was camped across the plains of Boeotia, north of Athens. Mardonius, Xerxes' hand-picked general, his cousin by marriage, one of the architects of the original invasion, commanded roughly 100,000 men. Cavalry, infantry, archers drawn from every corner of the empire. Across the field, the Greek coalition was fracturing before the battle even started. City-states that had pledged soldiers were pulling back. Supply lines were thinning. Commanders from different poles argued over positioning, over water access, over who would hold the most exposed wing. It was the kind of chaos that kills alliances before the first javelin is thrown. And in the center of all of it, holding the coalition together through sheer authority, stood Pausanias. He wasn't a king, not technically. He was regent, ruling in place of Pleistarchus, the young son of Leonidas, the man who died at Thermopylae 3 years earlier. Pausanias carried the weight of that legacy every time he gave an order. Every Greek soldier on that field knew whose seat he was keeping warm. But here's the thing about Plataea that most people miss. The battle almost didn't happen the way it did. Mardonius had spent days probing the Greek lines. His cavalry had cut off their water supply at the Gargathian spring. The Greeks were forced into a nighttime withdrawal, a maneuver that, in ancient warfare, was one of the most dangerous things an army could attempt. Units got separated. The Athenians moved too far east. The Spartans ended up isolated on the ridge near Plataea itself, exposed and outnumbered. Mardonius saw his opening. He sent the full weight of his infantry straight at the Spartan position. What happened next defined Pausanias, and eventually destroyed him. The Spartans held. Not because the plan was flawless, it wasn't. Not because the terrain favored them, it didn't. They held because Pausanias refused to give the order to charge until the sacrificial omens were favorable. His men were taking arrow fire, shields were splintering, and Pausanias stood there, waiting. When he finally gave the command, the Spartan line hit the Persian infantry so hard that Mardonius himself went down, killed in the fighting. His personal guard, the elite 1,000, broke apart, and with Mardonius dead, the Persian army collapsed from the center outward. By the end of the day, the invasion of Greece was over, and Pausanias had done something almost no one in Greek history had done before. He'd commanded a multi-city coalition, held it together against internal collapse, and delivered a decisive victory against the largest empire on earth. That kind of achievement does something to a man, especially a man who was never supposed to be anything more than a placeholder. After Plataea, the Greek alliance didn't dissolve, not immediately. There were still Persian garrisons scattered across the Aegean, islands to liberate, strategic choke points to secure. And Pausanias was the one they sent. Cyprus fell. Then Byzantium, the gateway between Europe and Asia, a city that controlled access to the Black Sea grain routes. Whoever held Byzantium held leverage over half the Greek world, Pausanias held Byzantium, and that's where the first reports started surfacing. Not about treason, not yet. Something quieter, something that, in Sparta, was almost worse. He changed. The way he dressed shifted. Persian robes appeared. A personal guard, not Spartan soldiers, but hired men, surrounded him. Banquets replaced communal mess halls. He adopted mannerisms, protocols, a style of authority that looked nothing like anything Sparta had ever produced. To the Ionian Greeks sailing under his command, it was unsettling. Several allied cities began sending complaints back to Sparta, not about military failure, but about arrogance, about a commander who was starting to behave less like a Spartan regent and more like the Persian governors they'd just finished overthrowing. Now here's where most accounts simplify the story. They say Pausanias became corrupt. That power went to his head, and that's probably part of it. But there's a detail that rarely gets attention. In Byzantium, Pausanias took custody of several high-ranking Persian prisoners, nobles, relatives of powerful satraps, men who, in the economy of ancient warfare, were worth enormous ransoms or could be traded for political advantage. Then those prisoners vanished. They were released quietly, without consultation, without any record of ransom being paid. Pausanias said it was an oversight, a miscommunication with the garrison. Nobody believed him, because the only person who benefited from releasing Persian nobles back to the empire was someone who wanted the empire to owe him a favor. And here's the question that started circulating through Sparta's ruling council. What kind of favor was Pausanias expecting in return? That question would take years to answer. And when the answer finally came, it arrived in the hands of a man who was never supposed to read it. Sparta moved carefully. They didn't send an army. They didn't issue a public accusation. They sent a message, a single line, as was Spartan custom, ordering Pausanias home. He came. That alone surprised people. A man with his own fleet, his own garrison, and control of one of the most strategically valuable cities in the Mediterranean. And he just returned to Sparta when summoned. Maybe he thought he could talk his way out of it. Maybe he thought they didn't have anything real. Or maybe, and this is what some ancient sources suggest, he believed his victory at Plataea still shielded him. He was half right. The ephors, the 5 annually elected officials who held oversight power even over kings, put him on trial. The charges were vague: misconduct, overreach, behavior unbecoming of a Spartan commander. Nothing stuck. There was no hard evidence. The released prisoners were suspicious, but suspicion doesn't carry a verdict in Sparta. The allied complaints about his behavior were damaging, but they came from Ionians, and Sparta didn't put much weight on what Ionians thought about anything. So they acquitted him, but they didn't send him back to Byzantium with a fleet. They stripped his command. The allied naval operations passed to Athens, specifically to a commander named Aristides, and later to Cimon, son of Miltiades. This was the pivot point that eventually gave Athens control of the Delian League, the alliance that would become an Athenian empire in all but name. Pausanias lost his position. He lost his fleet. He lost Byzantium. And then, without official authorization, he went back anyway. He secured a single trireme, sailed to the Hellespont, took up residence in the city of Colone on the coast of the Troad, and began operating independently. Running his own campaigns, making his own contacts, Sparta sent another message. This time, the tone was different. Come home. Now. Or be declared an enemy of the state. He came back again. Still confident, still untouched. But this time, something else followed him home. A trail of whispers that had nothing to do with Persian robes or missing prisoners. This trail connected Pausanias to a conspiracy that, if real, would make his dealings with Persia look minor by comparison. There's a part of this story that most retellings skip, or mention only in passing, because it complicates the narrative. Pausanias wasn't just allegedly negotiating with Persia, he was allegedly negotiating with the Helots. If you don't know what that means, you need to. Sparta's entire civilization ran on a system of forced labor. The Helots, subjugated population, mostly descended from the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, outnumbered Spartan citizens by a margin that ancient sources estimated at anywhere from 7-1 up to 20-1. They worked the land. They produced the food. They carried supplies in wartime, and they were never, at any point, free. Sparta's greatest fear, the thing that shaped its entire military culture, its social rigidity, its obsessive discipline, was a Helot uprising. The Crypteia, Sparta's secret police, existed specifically to identify and eliminate potential Helot leaders before any revolt could organize. Now imagine the effect of a single rumor. Pausanias is promising the Helots their freedom. It didn't matter whether it was true. The accusation alone was seismic. Because if Pausanias, a regent, a member of the Agiad royal house, a man with deep connections inside Sparta's military elite, had even hinted at offering Helot emancipation in exchange for their support in some kind of power grab, then Sparta wasn't dealing with a rogue general. They were dealing with an existential threat. And this is where the timeline gets tangled, because our main ancient sources, Thucydides and Plutarch, don't agree on how much of this was real and how much was manufactured by Pausanias' enemies. Thucydides mentions the Helot connection, almost in passing, as though it were common knowledge. Plutarch gives it more weight, but frames it more cautiously. What we know is this: the ephors now had two threads, the Persian negotiations still unproven, and the Helot conspiracy, terrifying but uncorroborated. Either one alone was enough to watch him closely. Together, they turned Pausanias into the most dangerous man in Sparta. But watching wasn't enough. They needed proof, and proof was about to walk through the gates of Sparta, carrying a letter it was never supposed to survive reading. His name is lost. What survives is what he did and why. Pausanias had been using personal couriers to communicate with Artabazus, a Persian satrap who served as the intermediary between the Greek regent and the court of Xerxes I. These weren't official dispatches. They were private letters, carried by men Pausanias selected himself, men loyal to him, not to Sparta. The system worked, until this particular messenger noticed something. None of the previous couriers had come back. Every man sent to deliver a letter to Artabazus had vanished. No return message, no reassignment, no trace, just silence. So before he left, he opened the letter. Inside, he found exactly what the ephors had been looking for. Pausanias was writing directly to Xerxes, or to Xerxes' representatives, offering to bring Greece under Persian control. In return, Pausanias wanted a position of authority. Some sources say he requested marriage into the Persian royal family, a union with Xerxes' daughter. Others say the terms were vaguer, but the intent was identical. Personal power, guaranteed by Persian backing, in exchange for Greek subjugation. And at the bottom of the letter, one final line: an instruction to kill the messenger once the delivery was made. He was carrying his own death warrant. The messenger didn't deliver the letter. He turned around and brought it straight to the ephors. Now, this should have been the end. A written letter, in Pausanias' own hand, detailing negotiations with the empire that had tried to burn Athens to the ground less than a decade earlier. It should have been enough, but the ephors hesitated. Not because they doubted the letter, because of what Pausanias represented. He was still a member of the Agiad royal house. He had still won Plataea. Arresting him publicly, on the strength of a single letter, carried by a man who might have his own motives for fabrication, that carried risks, political risks, social risks, the kind of risks that could fracture Sparta's ruling class. So instead of arresting him, they built a trap. And this trap required one thing from the messenger. Go back to Pausanias, confront him, get him to say it out loud. The plan was simple in concept and extraordinarily dangerous in execution. The messenger would meet with Pausanias. He would express distress, confusion about the letter, fear about what he'd read, a plea for reassurance. And while they spoke, the ephors would be listening. They dug a trench. The sources describe it differently. Thucydides says the ephors concealed themselves behind a partition or in a divided space near the meeting point. The idea was the same: hidden officials, close enough to hear every word. The messenger played his part. He confronted Pausanias, showed him the letter, told him what he'd read, said he was afraid. And Pausanias, instead of denying it, instead of claiming the letter was forged, instead of doing any of the things that might have saved him, confirmed everything. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. According to Thucydides' account, he tried to calm the messenger. He reassured him. He promised protection. He asked him to proceed with the delivery as planned and said no harm would come to him. Every word landed in the ears of the ephors sitting in the dark. They had what they needed. But here's the part that reveals how Sparta actually functioned behind the image of iron discipline. They didn't arrest him that night. They left. They withdrew, reconvened, and debated what to do, even with a first-hand confession still echoing. Because in Sparta, moving against a man of Pausanias' rank required consensus. It required certainty, not just that the act was justified, but that the political fallout could be contained. By the time they moved, Pausanias had already sensed something was wrong, and when the ephors finally came for him, he was already running. He didn't run far. He couldn't. Sparta wasn't a walled city in the traditional sense, but it was a closed society. There was no harbour to flee to, no foreign quarter to disappear into, no allied faction willing to shelter a man accused of conspiring with Persia and agitating the Helots. So Pausanias ran to the one place in Sparta where the rules changed, the temple of Athena Chalkioikos, Athena of the Bronze House, on the Acropolis, sacred ground. In Greek religious law, anyone who entered a temple and claimed the protection of the gods became a suppliant. Killing a suppliant inside a temple was an act of sacrilege, a violation that didn't just anger the gods but polluted the entire community. Plagues, crop failures, military defeats. The Greeks didn't treat divine pollution as metaphor. They treated it as cause and effect. Pausanias knew this. Every Spartan knew this. And the ephors knew it too, so they stopped at the entrance. For a moment, maybe longer, there was a standoff. Pausanias inside, breathing hard, pressed against the altar or the inner walls. The ephors outside, armed with the authority to arrest him, but bound by a religious prohibition that even they couldn't override. They couldn't go in. They couldn't drag him out. So they did something else. They removed the roof. Piece by piece, they stripped the timber and tiles from the top of the temple, exposing the interior to open sky. The theological logic, if you can call it that, was precise.